The dungeons were mysterious underground spaces that branched out like huge warrens. Some people explored those spacious caverns to make a fortune, and they were called adventurers. There are also those who wanted to defeat the dark forces lurking in a dungeon's depths, known as heroes. Luke was proud to say that he had been an adventurer for 15 years, and he got hired by a hero and his party to help fight a great evil. However, the hero he was working for betrayed him. So, how did Luke get into this mess? Let's see what happened a few hours ago. While Luke was resting, he was awakened by the angry hero with a kick to the gut. The guy wanted to know where the repair amulet was, reminding Luke he tasked him to set it in the center of the camp. Luke claimed he set it up like the hero said, only to be told that their food had been eaten. The hero blamed Luke and hit him again for his incompetence, but our boy had no clue what was going on. As it turned out, the amulet was placed in the wrong spot, and as a result, all their packs were outside its area of effect. Pissed, the hero asked their teammate, Julia, how much food they had left and learned that even if they were careful, they didn't have enough to get back to the surface once they were done. Because of that, the hero demanded Luke to fix his mess. In the adventurer's defense, he did exactly what the hero told him to do. To show the hero he was telling the truth, Luke pointed to the rocks he stacked to make a pedestal in the center of the camp. He stressed that the amulet was moved after he'd set it down, recalling that last night, the hero was thirsty and went over to the packs to get a drink. He wondered if the hero accidentally knocked something over, and the guy sheepishly said it was possible. Since that was the case, Luke asked him not to go around pointing fingers. But all of a sudden, one of the party members, Blanc, put a paralysis spell on Luke. For her, it didn't matter whose fault it was. What's important is what would happen next. If there wasn't enough food supply, then they should reduce the size of their party. After all, they had a prime candidate for sacrifice. Yep, we all know who Blanc was talking about, the third-rate nobody. The hero thought it was a good idea to sacrifice Luke, while Julia believed their supplies would last if rationed with the adventurer gone. The hero was certain that losing a man whose only skill was repair wouldn't hurt them much, and as a final act of mercy, he left a sword for Luke. The hero left with his party. In the present, the paralysis spell on Luke finally wore off. He acknowledged that he was a third-rate adventurer, for he still was an E rank, even though he had been adventuring for 15 years. To make things worse, the only skill he can use is repair. If he died in the dungeon he was in, he was sure that no one would miss him, not even the guild. But even so, he thought that being betrayed like that was way over the top. Despite what the hero's party did, he had no intention of dying down there. He had to survive and escape that dungeon. With no time to waste, Luke picked up the sword the hero left him and started looking for the exit. He knew he was nowhere near powerful enough to fight any strong monsters, so he must avoid drawing attention to himself. It didn't matter if it took him a few days. He would move carefully and quietly, and get out of that place. 2 weeks later, Luke was still in the dungeon and hadn't eaten a single thing since he set off alone. He survived so far, thanks to the magic-imbued water that ran through the caves. But humans could only live for about a month without food. Luke was long past the point of no return. As he came across a human skull, he remembered hearing from other adventurers that half the deaths in that dungeon were people who couldn't bear the hunger. They broke down and ate the poisonous lichens that grew on the walls. That aside, Luke needed to hurry. If he kept going, maybe he would run into another party of adventurers. All of a sudden, the skull that Luke had seen and the rest of the bones on the ground turned into an undead skeleton. It quickly came at Luke from behind with a sword, but luckily, he was quick to move. He managed to destroy the skeleton with his own sword, and he was thankful there was just one. The only problem was his blade broke when he struck the undead. As if that wasn't enough, he was out of iron powder, too. He guessed that using his repair skill on the sword too much without the proper materials made it brittle. With no other choice, Luke tried to repair the sword but failed. He wasn't sure if his repair skill failed, but to his surprise, the blade reformed. So, what happened just then? Actually, Luke had once heard that repair skill momentarily decomposes both the object in need of fixing and the pure material. Once recomposing was done, the object would be restored to its former shape. At this point, Luke touched the dungeon wall and recalled the hero trying to destroy it with his sword. The hero wanted to break the wall so they could make some progress, but Julia stressed he would just damage his weapon. The hero wasn't that worried, though, knowing he could just ask Luke to repair his sword if that happened. Still touching the wall, Luke activated his skill and successfully broke it. He was ecstatic because not even the hero could bust through the wall. At the same time, he noticed that the wall wasn't made of rock but something like metal that was hard enough to kill enemies. But wait, has his repair skill evolved somehow? He still didn't really understand how or why. but if it had, maybe he could use it for other things. Taking the sword he had just repaired, Luke merged it with the metal-like material he got from the wall and activated his skill. For the record, his repair skill couldn't create something out of nothing. It required an identical pure material to compensate for the broken portion of an object. If you didn't have any material, the skill compensated using other parts of the object in question. With a sword, any chips in the blade were restored using the unchipped portions. It was the reason why repairing without spare material only made your weapons brittle. On top of that, not every material could be used to repair an object. At the very least, you needed the same type of substance as the broken portion. But what if you could use anything as a raw material? If you could repair a sword with a material from a wall that not even a hero could break, then that sword would be the strongest weapon in the world. After using his skill, Luke propped the skeleton's weapon against the wall. He then hit and broke it with his sword, and he was glad to see that there wasn't a single scratch on his blade. He bet that with it, he could survive long enough to get out of the dungeon. And just to be safe, he decided to take some rubble from the wall with him. As Luke continued looking for the exit, he realized that opening holes in the walls and moving cautiously was way better than what he was doing before. If he carried on using his skill, he believed he would be able to find a way out of that dungeon. While walking, Luke wondered if his evolved skill would work on the lichens on the walls. He then took a lichen and attempted to use his skill on it, and when nothing happened, he remembered that living things could resist magic. All living things had an innate resistance to magical meddling due to their own intrinsic magic. So, Luke tried to hold the activation for a little longer, and while he managed to get the lichen to decompose, it wasn't very efficient. Maybe living things were just hard to dismantle. Then again, repair wasn't a skill that affected living things, and Luke doubted he would ever need to use it on one. Anyway, there was no time to hang around. Luke had to find the way out of that dungeon. Eventually, the adventurer saw the stairs leading to the exit and quickly climbed out of that place. It wasn't long before he got outside, and the first thing he did was rejoice. He survived. But first things first, he had to find something to eat. Luckily, he spotted some fruits in the nearby trees and immediately picked one. However, just as he was about to eat it, he realized that it was rotten. How did he know that? No idea. From a distance, Luke heard someone screaming. Without hesitation, he followed where the sound came from and saw two ladies in the middle of a fight. The one with a weapon, Sakura, told the other, Sylvia, to get out of there, but the crying girl refused to flee. This is where it dawned on Luke that they were facing a dragon, which he found confusing since dragons never left their dungeons. Luke also noticed that Sakura was injured and her sword was broken. There was no way she could fight the monster in that state. To help the ladies, Luke took one metal-like material from his small bag and threw it at the dragon. That was really brave of him, but it did absolutely nothing. He then called Sakura's attention and tossed his sword to her, saying it might help her. She was in his debt and caught the blade. With what little strength she had left, Sakura charged at the dragon and cut its head off. Luke and Sylvia quickly checked on her, but she lost consciousness after thanking the guy. Her wound looked fatal, Sylvia had no healing skills, and Luke didn't know how to treat Sakura either. All he could do was repair, and it wouldn't work on a person. Is that really true? Repair couldn't heal living things, everyone knew that. But even though Luke's decomposition was inefficient, he still managed to make the living lichen disintegrate back in the dungeon. His skill dismantled the pure material and the targeted area of the repair with magic, then recombined them to form the essential parts alone, restoring the object to its former shape. So, if Luke used that on a human body, it was worth a shot. Well, the clock was ticking, man. The injury was on the side of Sakura's torso, and she hadn't been given any first aid yet. In addition, neither Sylvia nor Luke had any other way of healing her. What was important right now was for Luke to remember what he did in the dungeon and believe there was a chance it would work. It was sink or swim. Failing and regretting it was 1,000 times better than not trying at all. At that moment, Luke asked Sakura not to hate him if he failed to treat her. Then, he used his repair skill on her and saw that nothing was happening, so he tried to hold the activation longer. In 15 years, Luke had seen countless adventurers sustain injuries. He watched his comrades breathe their last while screaming that they didn't want to die, and he wasn't able to do a single thing to help them. To be honest, it was maddening and heartbreaking. Understandably, he didn't want to feel any of those things again. Although Luke admitted he was a loser and a useless adventurer, he hadn't fallen so low that he'd abandon someone in need. That's why now, no matter how hard it was, he would do his best to help Sakura. Later, Luke woke up in an unfamiliar room and recalled using repair on Sakura, assuming he had passed out right after. Then, he noticed Sylvia standing by the door and learned he was at her place, the Spring Leaves Inn. The lady also shared that Luke had been asleep for almost half a day, which got her worried. Since he was flat out broke, Luke tried to get up and told Sylvia he would get out of her hair. But Sylvia didn't want his money, for he had saved her and Sakura from the dragon. As it became clear to Luke that the girl thought she owed him, he stated that he didn't do anything grandiose. Still, he wanted to thank Sylvia for her kind words. Luke asked Sylvia about the samurai, referring to Sakura. According to Sylvia, Sakura made a full recovery. Luke couldn't express how relieved he was right now, knowing that he'd never sleep again if the person he tried to help had died. When asked if he was an exceptionally strong healer, Luke replied that he was just a third-rate rank adventurer with only one skill: repair. Sylvia couldn't believe what he just said, but before she could ask more questions, she heard the guy's stomach growling. Truth be told, the adventurer felt like he was dying. Remember, he had nothing but water for 2 weeks. Upon learning this, Sylvia offered to make him something to eat right away. After a few minutes, Luke savored the food that Sylvia had prepared. Then, the lady admitted she never thought anyone would come to save them at the bottom of the dungeon. Confused, Luke tried to clarify that they were out front. To his shock, Sylvia said they were 5 levels down. Now even more puzzled, Luke asked Sylvia the name of the place where they met. Sylvia shared it was the E-rank dungeon, Sundial Forest, which the guy had never heard of. He had no idea that it was an open-type dungeon, like a big amphitheater. Luke was in the A-rank dungeon, 1000-year passage to hell, which must mean that the levels of the 2 dungeons were linked. Sakura and Sylvia went to the Sundial Forest to harvest medicinal herbs, but of course, it was dangerous for novices to head into a dungeon alone. Luke also learned that no one tried to stop the girls from going to the Sundial Forest, which was only officially recognized as a dungeon last year. People had always gone there to gather herbs and vegetables. Okay, if it was recognized as a dungeon, then obviously there were monsters in that forest, right? Despite knowing that, Sylvia explained they had no idea that one of those monsters would be a dragon. Besides, the guild didn't post any warnings about it. Needless to say, Luke was shocked that the guild was not aware of the dragon. I mean, seriously, a dragon is hard to miss. Sylvia swore that the Adventurers Guild was clueless about the creature, and in fact, the person from the guild who listened to their story was surprised, too. Luke could understand the lack of notice if it was just a weaker monster, but he couldn't imagine that the guild would fail to warn people about a dragon. Well, there was nothing they could do about it anymore. Luke apologized to Sylvia because it sounded like he was blaming her for what happened. But the lady didn't mind. She knew he was just worried about her and Sakura. The two then introduced themselves to each other, and since commoners like them didn't have family names, they just used the name of their birthplace. Sometimes, commoners used their trade, too. Eventually, Luke fell asleep, so Sylvia covered him with a blanket and silently thanked him for what he did for her and Sakura. The next day, Luke took a bath and felt more alive. He learned from Sylvia that the place they were in was called Green Hollow, which was renowned for its hot springs. At first, he thought it was strange to be able to bathe so early in the morning, but it soon made sense to him since the place had constant access to hot water. Once he was done taking a bath, Luke explored the area and bumped into Sakura. He asked the girl about her wound, and just like Sylvia said, she made a full recovery. Sakura then noted it was crazy that they ran into a dragon while gathering herbs. At the same time, she was ashamed that a warrior in training like her had to rely on Luke to save her. When Sakura mentioned her favorite katana breaking while she was fighting the dragon, Luke asked her where it was. So, she showed her broken sword to Luke and went to the Spring Leaves Inn with him, where she revealed there were no weapon shops in that town. In other words, she was stuck without a sword. But Luke didn't want her to worry, letting her know that his specialty was repair. Although Luke was facing the other way, he still noticed Sylvia standing outside the room. Embarrassed, Sylvia explained she was just curious and asked the guy if she could watch them. That's not a problem for Luke, but he pointed out he wasn't going to do something compelling. Also, he wondered if Sylvia wouldn't be missed at work, but it was okay since she was on a break. Alright, it was time to get started. As Luke touched the katana, he saw its information in his mind. He recalled that this happened when he tried to eat a berry in the forest, knowing that the fruit was rotten just by touching it. At this point, Luke realized that this part of his skill had also evolved and decided to call it analysis. With it, he could analyze the condition of what he wanted to repair before proceeding with decomposition and recomposition. To put it simply, each stage of Luke's repair skill had become its own independent ability. Moments later, Luke finished fixing Sakura's katana. He refused to let Sakura pay for what he did, knowing she didn't have much money since she was in training. For him, Sakura could just consider that as a thank you because she saved his life. Aside from that, Luke wanted to know if Sakura had another way of earning money, and when she admitted that she didn't, he suggested she give adventuring a try. He explained that she could take on quests when she wanted, so she could choose her jobs and schedule. As Sakura agreed, Luke asked Sylvia if there was a guild in that town, and immediately, the lady took him and Sakura there. Sylvia introduced Luke to her friend, Merida, the receptionist, and said he had some business with the guild. After that, Luke informed her that Sakura would like to register as an adventurer. Merida then asked her to fill out a form and started going through the basics with her. In the guild, there were 6 ranks, from A to F regardless of ability. Everyone started out as an F rank. F rankers couldn't participate in dungeon raids, and once they completed a number of simple quests, they would rise to E rank. From that point on, the guild would evaluate E rankers and decide when they could progress to the next rank. The higher one's rank was, the more dungeons they could enter and the more quests they could take on. Dungeons were also ranked from A to E, and adventurers must remember that they could only enter a dungeon equal to or lower than their own rank. For parties, dungeon levels were based on the rank of the party leader. As Sakura finished filling out the form, Merida told her she would have more choices if she got her level up. Then, she checked Sakura's registration form and learned she was the one who killed the dragon in the Sundial Forest. Naturally, the other adventurers started talking about them. Once the guild reported that to their main office, they would give Sakura a cash bonus. So, Merida planned to get the paperwork started right away. She also praised Sakura for defeating a dragon in just one hit, but the lady explained that she was only able to slay the creature because of the sword that Luke gave her. To clarify, she wanted to split the reward with Luke, who noticed that they were drawing a lot of attention. Luke asked Merida if he could cut in a second, revealing he wanted to take a break from adventuring. He wondered if there was a good spot in that town where he could open a weapon shop. Well, there was no way the newbie adventurers would ignore a rumor this tasty. At that moment, everyone in the guild was already talking about the guy who made a sword that's strong enough to kill a dragon in one hit, and how he's going to set up shop in that town. Merida shared she knew of a house Luke could use, but when the guy decided to use his portion of the reward to buy it, she let him know it was crumbling where it stood. Of course, Luke wasn't worried at all since he could just repair the house. Meanwhile, Sylvia was curious if Merida was talking about the place on the outskirts of town and emphasized it was beyond saving. While the confident guy thought about fixing the house, Sakura asked him to just take her share of the reward. After all, she would be earning money from adventuring, so she wanted Luke to use the reward for the shop he wanted to set up. Seeing that Luke was reluctant, Sylvia proposed they make it an advance payment for urgent repairs. If it's a payment for service, she's sure that he will accept it. Sakura also had one other request. She wanted Luke to make her a katana, just like his sword, which is strong enough to slay a dragon. Now that's an arrangement Luke can agree to. Declaring they have a contract, Luke tells Sakura she's his very first customer. This is where he scrambles for his new life as an owner of a weapon shop. Later, Luke headed to the house Merida was talking about with Sylvia and Sakura. Everything inside was broken due to a tree that fell on it, but Luke was hopeful he would be able to fix it even though he had never repaired something that big before. Using fallen trees to compensate for the parts that had rotted through, Luke began repairing the house, much to the lady's awe. After a few minutes, he successfully restored it. However, restoring a whole house took a ton of Luke's power, and he wasn't even done yet. He needed something to sell, so he couldn't get tired. As expected, the girls asked Luke not to push himself. When he made it clear he had no intention of resting, especially since he had already started advertising, Sylvia offered to clean the place while Sakura stressed she was helping, too. They then decided to begin with the shop stock, which Luke bought from the guild at a cheap price. With his repair skill, he quickly fixed a broken sword and left the ladies astonished. After witnessing Luke in action, Sylvia realized that it was cheaper to repair broken weapons than to stock the shop with new items. That's why a weapon shop was perfect for Luke. All they needed now was an eye-catching featured display. Since Luke used the sword that killed the dragon for publicity, he wanted to have items similar to it so as not to disappoint his customers. The question was, would he be able to make more amazing swords like his blade? By the way, Luke disintegrated the pure material he picked up in the dungeon into fine powder. Sadly, he knew that making another sword like his with that tiny bag of powder was impossible. He explained to Sakura that that stuff increased the strength of the blade, but his acquisition channels were a trade secret. Luke fixed one of the broken swords before working on the rest. Once he was done, he thought about how to procure materials. While doing so, Sakura expressed surprise that this was his business with the guild. Actually, since she mentioned to Luke that there were no weapon shops in that town, the guy had given it a lot of thought. He wanted to know what newbie adventurers there needed the most, so Sylvia said weapons and armor. Because of that, Luke assumed she was from a merchant family. Sakura then asked why he was working as an adventurer until now when he was so skilled at restoring items. Realizing he never told the ladies what happened to him in the dungeon, he admitted he only thought of opening up a shop recently and shared how he was betrayed by his comrades. He just chose not to reveal that he was left to die by the hero's party. That aside, Luke confessed that the reason he wanted to keep being an adventurer was longing. There was this party of adventurers that used to come to his village when he was a kid, and hearing tales of their fantastic adventures planted the seed of longing inside him. His parents told him it was a stupid idea, but he rebelled against them and left their village. That's why he stayed an adventurer all this time, even as a perpetual E-ranker. When asked if he ever regretted his decision, Luke said he didn't because he enjoyed it. His last quest was a wake-up call, though. It was a good opportunity for him to start afresh. But then again, he could thank that quest for his ability. Now, he could live a comfortable and quiet life as a weapon seller. After ordering the sign for his shop, Luke went outside and bumped into a man who was curious if he was the one who saved the girl from the Spring Leaves Inn. When Luke confirmed it, the man told him he knew the family who ran that inn pretty well and gave him some food for free. He also added that a lot of their customers were really looking forward to Luke's shop. As our boy continued walking, he thought about how no one expected much from him and thanked him for anything when he was adventuring. Luke then found Sakura talking to some kids who wanted her to display her swordsmanship. Although she believed that sword art wasn't for show, Sakura tossed a piece of wood into the air and cut it into pieces. Luke couldn't believe how quick she was, knowing that one would need not only speed but also technique to make 2 slashes in an instant. This only proved that Sakura was a pretty skilled sword wielder. Anyway, Sakura was embarrassed to see that Luke was watching her and explained that no one displays their skills in her hometown. Simply put, receiving open praise like that was extremely rare for her. Seeing no problem with that, Luke shared his food with Sakura and teased her about how much she loved to eat. In the girl's defense, her hometown was very strict, so she always spread her wings a little whenever she was in Green Hollow. She also added that she was returning home tomorrow for a short visit, but she was planning to make Green Hollow her home base. First, she needed to collect a particular material she wanted Luke to use in making her katana. She apologized to Luke that she wouldn't be able to help with the shop preparations, but Luke assured her there was nothing to worry about. He promised that when Sakura comes back, he'll surprise her with the most splendid shop. Later on, the store sign was finally placed in front of Luke's shop. At the same time, Luke had already put up posters in town about his shop's opening. He couldn't think of anything to call his store, so he just decided to use the name of his birthplace for it. He then thanked Sylvia for helping him, but it wasn't a big deal for the lady. It wasn't long before customers started lining up outside Luke's shop, so he and Sylvia welcomed them to the grand opening of the White Wolf Arms. It hadn't been long since Luke opened his shop, but he had already gotten used to dealing with customers. One day, Sylvia visited Luke with a bottle of liquor from Merida. According to the receptionist, everyone was overjoyed because they had grown more powerful, thanks to the materials they had harvested from the dragon's body. As Luke recalled that Merida ran the bar as a side business, Sylvia said the liquor was part thank you, part shop-warming gift. Looking around the shop, Sylvia wanted to confirm that the swords were only replicas of Luke's weapon and stated he could charge more for the actual blade. Sure enough, the guy said he could charge several sovereigns for it. Sylvia was surprised because that's what ordinary folks earned in a year, so Luke pointed out he couldn't easily make another sword like the one that killed the dragon. In addition, he couldn't just go collect more of the material he used on it, and he didn't intend to sell the blade. Even if he wanted to get more of the pure material, he'd have to return to the 1,000-year passage to hell with an Aranker leading the party. Moments later, 2 men entered the shop and asked if that was the establishment with the Dragon Slayer sword. Upon confirming that they were in the right place, the blonde guy declared he wanted to buy the famous sword and refused to purchase the poor quality replicas on display when Luke asked him to check them out. The guy stressed he wanted to buy the original sword, but the weapon shop owner said he hadn't put it up for sale. Not wanting to waste time, the customer asked his companion to show Luke their money. The man took out 5 gold sovereigns, and when Luke failed to answer immediately, he took out another 5. Smiling, Blondie wondered if he could now come to an agreement with Luke. In the end, Luke agreed to sell the Dragon Slayer sword for 10 gold sovereigns. Once the men left, Luke noted they might have been knights or noble envoys since no adventurer could shell out that much money. At the very least, the blonde guy seemed to be a real connoisseur. He immediately saw through the quality of the other swords. That said, Luke had no idea why someone like that would come to Green Hollow. All of a sudden, Sakura arrived and greeted Luke and Sylvia. She already had the material for her katana, but first, the three of them had lunch together. While eating, Sakura complimented Luke's shop and expressed how happy she was that he had a lot of customers. She also learned from Sylvia that the guy had been hired to restore some of the buildings in town. Sakura was sure that he would earn back his startup fees in no time. But the truth was that he earned most of that already. Sylvia revealed to Sakura that the Dragon Slayer sword had been sold for 10 gold sovereigns. Sad to say, the trio could only wonder about the identity of the person who bought the sword. Now, Luke wanted to talk about Sakura's katana, so the girl showed him the material she got for it, which was called Hihirikane. It looked like a gemstone, but it was definitely metal. Sakura shared that one of the goals of her journey was to find someone to forge a katana out of that metal, saying no one in her hometown could do it. Even in the East, that knowledge was lost. Sakura told Luke that no new armor or tools could be made from Hihirikane. As Sakura entrusted the precious material to Luke, the guy admitted the process was complex and might take a little time. Also, he explained that he was using the memory of the original object's shape to make it whole again. Remember, his repair skill only restored objects to their original state. In other words, he couldn't just make a sword out of Hihirikane right away. If Luke recomposed half the ore bit by bit into an existing katana until it learned the shape, then he could decompose the blade and the rest of the ore before recomposing it all. That way, Luke could make Sakura a 100% pure Hihirikane blade, even though it was kind of like a cheat workaround. Although he'd never actually tried it before, Luke thought the theory was sound and got Sakura excited. Sakura then asked him to make her a 50% Hihirikane blade before remaking it to 100%. Wasting no time, Luke got to work and turned Sakura's katana pink because combining the ore with regular metal lightens the color. Thrilled, Sakura went outside and used a low-level fire skill to set her sword ablaze, explaining that items made from Hihirikane conduct fire and amplify its intensity. After that, Sakura took a chunk of wood and threw it high before destroying it with her katana. With Sakura's display of skills, those around her could only stare at her with their mouths open. It looked like Luke had just made the most absurdly overpowered weapon in history. If Sakura used a higher level fire skill on her katana, then how strong would that be? Even a short time ago, Luke never would have imagined that he'd be capable of making something like that. For him, it seemed so unreal that a perpetual E-ranker like him could make such a powerful weapon. Looking at his delighted friends, he never thought that there would be people who'd appreciate his skill. Sakura wanted Luke to make him a short sword, and Luke agreed without hesitation. Afterward, Luke finished his tasks for the day. He planned to start working on Sakura's short sword immediately, but on his way to his shop, he was stopped by some knights who wanted to talk to him. One of the knights stated they were the Order of Silver Wings, but Luke had never heard of that before. Then, the other knight, Garnet, confronted Luke for playing dumb and exclaimed the evidence against him was mounting. When Luke apologized for being clueless, the knight got pissed and grabbed him by the collar. Thankfully, the commanding officer stopped Garnet from making a scene and said the truth might get twisted if he interrogated Luke. At the same time, he threatened to report Garnet to Lord Carmine for disobeying orders, so the short knight tried to calm down and asked him to leave his brother out of this. Apologizing for the rough greeting, the commanding officer removed his helmet and introduced himself as Felix, the vice commander of the order. He wanted Luke to come with them because they had important things to discuss with him. On the other hand, the third knight made it clear that it would be considered obstruction if Luke refused to come with them, and they would do worse than yank his shirt. With no other choice, Luke invited the knights to his shop, where they could talk. At this point, Sylvia noticed what was happening and learned from Luke that the knights wanted to discuss something with him. Worried, Sylvia told Luke she was coming with him and rushed back to their inn to inform her mother about it. Luckily, Felix allowed Sylvia to join them and said she would just have to give consent to be Luke's official witness. Once the lady returned, Garnet remained outside while Luke and the others sat inside the shop, where Felix asked him to describe each member of the hero's party. Luke began telling Felix how Falcon was very overconfident. Whenever he made a mistake out of pride, he would use his numerous skills to try and fix it. Julia the Knight was Falcon's childhood friend and his lover. She would do whatever Falcon asked. She only ever stood up to him when it concerned other women. The White Mage, Blanc, was the one who proposed to abandon Luke. She always rubbed people the wrong way. As for the last member, Luke was not really sure what to say. It was the White Mage, Noir. She had so little presence that Luke honestly couldn't describe what she was like. Luke still wasn't very sure why Felix was so interested to know about them. Felix then revealed that Falcon and his party were missing in action. The Order of the Silver Wings was to investigate their whereabouts. Luke was very confused. He hadn't heard anything about that. He told the guild that they were probably still inside the dungeon. Felix revealed that the fact that Luke left the dungeon without his party was the major cause that led to accusations of foul play. The ministers sponsoring Falcon as hero have claimed that there was no doubt that Falcon died due to betrayal by Luke. The best course of action would be to interrogate the traitor for details. Sylvia banged the table and called the accusations absurd. She knew Luke wasn't that kind of person at all. Felix asked her to calm down. The ministers believed that Luke stole the hero's weapon. The knights were appointed to retrieve the so-called Dragon Slayer sword. The soldier in the room removed his helmet and Luke realized that it was the same guy that had come earlier in his shop. He realized that that's how the blondie and this guy had so much money. It was a political assignment. Ultimately, the minister's reasoning had proved false, but now they had turned up a different problem. Felix revealed that the sword Luke made contained mithril. Sylvia asked Luke about mithril. Mithril was a precious metal with a terrifyingly high magic affinity. Royal permission had to be taken to gather it, let alone sell it. The worst-case scenario was the death penalty. Sylvia was scared. She turned to Luke to confirm if the sword was made using the walls of the dungeon. Luke realized he couldn't analyze it, probably because it was a metal he had never seen before. Felix told Luke that since his production of mithril weapons was not intentional, he could not be charged. If he really made that sword from the dungeon walls, no one could have known there would be mithril in them. In order to prove that, Luke must disintegrate part of the dungeon wall with Felix and the knights as witnesses. Luke agreed since doing that word cleared up any suspicions. He could not believe that Felix and the ministers believed that he betrayed his team. Felix assured Luke that he did not believe his betrayal. In terms of Luke's abilities alone, he thought it was impossible. But the short guard outside, Garnet, seemed to believe that Luke was guilty. Garnet loathed mithril bootleggers, which is why he probably took that attitude with Luke. Felix decided to escort Luke to the dungeon to gather rock from the walls. Pretty soon, Garnet had a change of attitude and counted on Luke finding this change of attitude even weirder. As they were shaking hands, Garnet clenched Luke's wrist and was looking forward to bust his lies wide. Secura approached them and Garnet told her to back off, as outsiders had no say in official business. Secura was not an outsider. Felix had given her permission to accompany them. Luke was sorry to make Secura act like a bodyguard and tour guide. Secura was more than happy to help out Luke. Garnet smirked about how Luke always needed a bodyguard since he was a typical E-ranker. Felix overheard everything and warned Garnet about reporting him to Carmine if he decided to overstep his boundary again. Garnet was hesitant to agree, but gave in. Luke taunted Garnet and knew that Carmine was both his boss and his big brother. He knew about Carmine being Garnet's brother, as earlier Garnet asked Felix to leave his big brother out when threatened to be reported. Garnet was pretty surprised that Luke remembered all those tiny details. Luke remembered everything because he was a perpetual E-ranker and was quite good at listening for useful information. The vice commander was ready to set off. They came across a dragon's remains, and also the remains of a few adventurers were found. Luke taunted Garnet for wearing full body armor because he was scared of dragons. Garnet was red with anger and denied Luke's statement. There hadn't been a single eyewitness report of another dragon. Later, they came across the 1,000-year path to hell, the dungeon. They walked down the stairs and realized that they would have to investigate the lower-level dungeon as well. They finally came across the wall that Luke used for the repair. At first glance it appeared to be merely stone. If it was part of the dungeon, then the walls would be virtually indestructible. Garnet knew that if he knocked down that wall, then Luke would prove to be a fraud. Luke was well aware of this. With all his strength, Garnet activated his skill and kicked the wall. Naughty when a hero could break through the stuff. It was like a cluster of metal inside. Luke was brought forward, and he activated his skill. Luke found himself in a strange and dark dungeon. With surprising strength, he broke the dungeon wall, creating a pile of rubble. What amazed everyone was how he then turned that rubble into a sword. Felix, a fellow knight, was astonished, not believing his own eyes. This unique sword, made from dungeon debris, would later become the weapon that killed a dragon. Felix needed to understand the material of the dungeon walls, so he asked Bradford, another knight, to collect samples. Turning to Luke, Felix requested him to break more walls at different points. However, Luke was nervous and hesitant, not wanting to go any deeper. Felix explained that they needed samples from various places to know the composition of each wall. Garnet, another person in the group, noticed Luke's fear and teased him. Felix intervened, asking Garnet to stop and reassuring Luke that his help was crucial and appreciated. Despite his apprehensions, Luke continued breaking walls, and they managed to extract a significant amount of mithril, a valuable metal. They carefully loaded it into small bags and carried them out of the dark and narrow dungeon. Garnet, still not fully understanding the situation, couldn't believe Luke survived in such a place for 2 weeks. Felix informed the group that they would take the medal home for appraisal, promising to contact Luke with the results. Sakura, another person in the group, suggested taking some dragon bones as souvenir for the knights. Garnet, uninterested in the events, decided to head home. An annoyed Luke asked if Garnet knew the way back. Then, unexpectedly, a giant dragon foot appeared from the sky and crushed Garnet. The scene was shocking, with blood splattering everywhere, even reaching Luke's face. The mighty dragon remained present, flapping its wings. The turn of events left Luke in disbelief, witnessing the sudden and tragic end of Garnet. The group now faced a new challenge with the dragon's ominous presence, adding a layer of complexity to their already uncertain situation in the dungeon. Things didn't just end there. Other dragons were seen flying above their heads. The dragons screeched out, with their majestic wings flapping in the air. Felix knew that his group wouldn't stand a chance against them, and told everyone to run. Bradford stepped up and with his skill, bound the dragons with chains of binding. Luke could not believe how easily Bradford took down so many dragons with just one skill. Sakura swiftly jumped in the air and slashed the dragon's neck with her sword. The biggest dragon of the pack was lurking behind Sakura and attacked her. But Felix activated his skill shield and saved her. The group decided to work together to defeat the dragon. Luke felt very pathetic. Even though his skill had evolved, he was still useless in a battle. He decided to do his best in the fight in front of him. He rushed over to Garnet, only to find out that his body had lost a lot of blood. But he was still breathing. His face was almost completely crushed. Luke wondered if there was still time. If he ignored the alarm and focused on the body, he might save Garnet. Luke then realized that dragon fire reached all the way out to them. If they didn't move, they would be in the range of a direct attack. Luke decided to make the repair. He activated his skill to target the dungeon ball that he merged with the sword and then used the earth as the raw material to compensate. As someone who was abandoned for being useless, Luke could not even think of abandoning someone else at death's door. Luke was doing his best to bring back Garnet. He wasn't doing bad, considering he had never tried anything like this before. He wanted Garnet to get ready to apologize for everything that had come out of his mouth. With a swoosh, Garnet was finally saved. But wait, Garnet was revealed to be a girl. Luke was staring at Garnet's breast, which was hanging out of her armor. Garnet got up and felt wobbly. This was because she had lost a lot of blood, even though Luke fixed her wound. Suddenly she realized that Luke had seen her body. In Luke's defense, he had no idea that Garnet was actually a woman. Luke asked Garnet to turn around so that he could fix up her armor. It was true that a man could have the name Garnet, but one could never guess that under all that armor, there could be a woman's body. Luke activated his kill and fixed her armor. They were not on the front line, so the armor would be sufficient to hold. Luca and Garnet decided to just wait for Sakura and the others to finish off the dragon. Garnet asked Luke if he knew why she was hiding her sex. Luke had assumed that she didn't want him to know her reasons. Garnet clenched her fist and bent her knee to apologize to Luke for being very rude earlier. Luke thought Garnet hated him because he was under the suspension of smuggling mithril. He assured her that she did not have to say anything she did not want to, as she must have had reasons. Garnet decided to not make any excuses and was more sincerely grateful to Luke for healing her. Without him, she would be as good as dead. Luke was surprised, but he was enjoying this. Water under the bridge. Garnet wanted Luke to forget about seeing her breast. A loud boom was heard in the distance and they assumed that the group had defeated the dragon. They decided to head back and meet up with the others. Luke asked Garnet to stand up, and she somehow did. He wondered if Garnet was comfortable with others seeing her without her helmet. But Felix and Bradford had already seen her like that before. But neither of them knew that she was a woman. The Order had stupid antiquated rule that only men were allowed to join. Luke realized that Garnet had been pushing the idea of her being the commander's little brother. Even Felix referred to Garnet as a boy. Hazen for wanting to be in the Order must be something big if she was going so far as to hide her sex. Luke was curious, but it was none of his business. As the two were walking back, Garnet pointed out a huge hole in the cliff. Neither of them had noticed this on their way here. They realized that the ivy going around the cliff covered the whole area when they passed earlier. Something gigantic must have burst out while they were heading down into the caves. They guessed whether the dragon that appeared in the Sundial Forest had probably come out of that hole. The guild wouldn't have noticed the hole there either. Suddenly, there was some rumbling around the hole, and the hole was closing. It was a pretty common trap mechanism for dungeons. But if the mechanism was out there, it meant that the dragon must be a part of the track. Luke and Garnet wondered if somebody was controlling the dragon. If they were right, then they must be a switch that activated the trap. Garnet called out Luke. There was a person right under the hole. Luke raised to help the woman lying under the hole, on the ground. The woman was still conscious. Luke realized that the woman was none other than Noir. Luke asked her about what she was doing out there. She had heard that the rest of the party hadn't returned. Noir started sobbing and rushed to cry in Luke's arms. She was frantically apologizing. Luke asked about the others. Before she could say anything, she was pushed down by an unknown entity from someplace else. Luke was flabbergasted. Some time later, Noir opened her eyes. She was surrounded by Luke, Sakura, and Felix. She wondered who Felix was. He introduced himself as the Order of the Silver Wings. He was investigating the disappearance of the hero Falcon by order of the king. He wanted Noir to tell him exactly what happened. Noir took off her clothes and revealed a big demonic curse mark on her back. Felix had heard rumors of spells that demons cast on others to control them. Judging by the pattern, it blocked the sharing of certain information, which is why she couldn't talk about it. Felix asked Luke to try and remove the curse using his skill. Even though her complexity in Luke's betrayal was unforgivable, that was no time to hold grudges. Danger could be approaching their town very soon. Even though Luke was lost in the dungeon, his repair skill evolved. He could use his skill and heal the wounds on living creatures. He could heal Noir's back just as easily he could take her apart. Luke activated his skill and proceeded to heal her. A weird slimy creature jumped from her back and grabbed Luke's hand. It was no ordinary curse, it was alive. It was a mimic. They usually waited for the brightest guys as treasure chests or entire dungeon rooms. Felix had never seen one mimicking a curse mark before. The mimic was trying to sap Luke's magic, but he was not ready to give in. Luke started to repair his right arm and decompose the mimic. With all the magic he had left, he destroyed the mimic. The curse mark was gone. An adventure survived by not losing sight of the priorities. Getting distracted by a shiny object and forgetting what's important could be deadly. Everybody was relieved, including Noir. Luke knew that there was an unknown danger drawing close to that town. Learning whatever they could about that danger was the highest priority. He asked Noir to tell them everything she knew. The day before the heroes abandoned Luke, they reached the deepest part of the dungeon. There is the point where they would stand to chant the password. Falcon asked Noir to check it out with her magic. Then they found an impossible vast cavern. Around the outskirts were the great mines and dwarves enslaved by dark elves. The inner lands were barren, undeveloped, and home to dragons. There was a small town halfway across. That's where they would find the man they sought. 2 months earlier, the dwarves' chieftain appealed to the king for aid, so the king sent Falcon and his party on a mission. They were heading straight across the inner lands, their priority boss to avoid detection by the dark elves. They came across a giant door. It was not for human use based on its size. Falcon decided to use the password to open the door, but nothing happened. The next day, they reached the town. Looked like only dwarves lived there. Noir casted an invisibility spell on the party, and they carried on. They met the man they were seeking. He was a dwarf, and he had been waiting for them. The Dark Hills had appeared out of nowhere. They took his people as their slaves. Felix agreed to defeat the evil overlord, even though the orders stated that they only had to survey the area. Blanc sensed that Noir was nervous and asked her about it. Noir had a terrible feeling about what was to come. The party was welcome to rest there. It was nightfall, and in the other room, Falcon and Julia were having loud sex, much to the disturbance of Noir and Blanc. It turned out that Falcon and Julia had been a couple long before the formation of the party. Despite the impending mission to storm the Overlord's keep the next morning, their passion seemed to know no bounds. The sounds were impossible to ignore, and Noir and Blanc couldn't help but be affected. Blanc, ever curious, wondered if she enjoyed listening to such activities. However, Noir dismissed the idea, finding the situation rather uncomfortable. Blanc couldn't fathom what Julia saw in Falcon. To her, he seemed like a boastful womanizer. Noir, on the other hand, acknowledged Falcon's talents, believing that he had some redeeming qualities. Unlike others he considered worthless. As the night unfolded, the contrasting views on Falcon's character added a touch of humor and tension to the party's temporary abode. The impending mission weighed on their minds, but the unexpected soundtrack of Falcon and Julia's passionate night took center stage, leaving Noir and Blanc with mixed feelings and a sense of anticipation for the challenges that awaited them in the morning. When the time came, the party was ready. They reached an intervention. Old Guy talked about it. They wanted to find this evil overlord and send him back to hell. The door creaked open and many enemies were already in position to attack. The entrance was heavily guarded. There was even a giant golem in the room. It was a one-sided battle from the start. Every victory just brought more soldiers to attack them. The old man had lied to them. The fighting became increasingly violent. Whenever Luke repaired broken weapons, he always added a material. He said that the pairing without extra material to compensate only weakened the weapon. Falcon's sword was being repaired over and over again. They somehow managed to get to the throne room. The Elf King was sitting on the throne. He was the Dark King, Gandalf, who knew such a small force could penetrate his fortress. Falcon decided to attack Gandalf, and Gandalf had no choice but to activate his powers and attack the party. Noir activated her powers as well. This amused Gandalf. An elf commander decided to step in and fight Falcon. With just one strike of his sword, Falcon's sword got broken in half. Falcon was still in shock that his sword had been crushed in half. The elf commander was going to strike and kill Falcon, but Julia leaped forward and saved his life. She was stabbed and was bleeding. She asked Falcon to take her sword. Falcon was raging with fury and attacked the enemy. No matter how hard he died, he could not defeat the enemy. Falcon lost. Gandalf noticed that to reach them, the party must have cut the golems outside. It appeared that the blade had suffered significant damage fighting the enemy. Therefore, after the repeated low-level repairs, battling must have been very difficult. Falcon realized that they lost because they were too low-level, and if they had Luke with them, they could have had a victory. Gandalf grabbed Noir and placed the curse mark on her back, and then locked her up along with Julia and Blanc. The guards gave them food and left them unbound in their cell. They couldn't dispel the dread in their hearts. First, they took Julia. She demanded that they would tell her where Falcon was being kept, but they never answered. Then Blanc was taken away, just when they had grown used to being alone. She cried when they took her, but Noir couldn't do anything to stop them. Neither of them ever returned. Finally, it was Noir's turn to be taken away. Before they could do anything to her, a loud rumble was heard. The guards rushed out to see what was going on. Noir decided to get out of there. Using what meager magic she had left, she fled. She kept running and closed the Dragonlands. She returned to the entrance for the upper levels of the dungeon. However, the guards had taken positions at the entrance. Her magic was spent, so she couldn't conceal herself anymore, and she certainly did not have the strength to punch through the soldiers. She saw the big door she had seen earlier. She had no idea where the door led, but her only chance of survival was to go through it. She summoned every last bit of strength and climbed the steep slope beyond the door. She finally saw light. She was finally going to be free. She fell down from a great height. Her whole body was hurting and she knew she was going to die there. She was sorry that she couldn't save her sister. She had almost given up, but then she heard voices. That was when Luke found her. She had never hoped to see him again. After she was done telling her story, she was allowed to rest. Luke did not know where to even start making sense of that. Felix had to request aid from the king. Felix had utmost faith in Luke, since he had saved Garnet's life after all. Sylvia approached them and asked them to come with her for a minute. It was an emergency. In a local bar, the people of the town were in distress. They couldn't possibly take on a diagonal lift. They couldn't stay in such a dangerous town. Even if the adventurers left, what would happen to their stores? Fewer patrons were coming to the hot springs after that dragon sighting. The guild needs to do something about that. The people asked Luke if it was true that another dragon appeared. They had no idea this town was so dangerous. Most of the adventurers in Green Hollow were E-rankers, but if enemies as strong as that dragon kept showing up, it would wreak havoc. Luke assured them that it would all be okay. The palace was going to send the reinforcements, and once they did, they would all feel safe again. But what until then? The danger was still out there. If the people even went a few days without customers, their food stock would go to waste, and the reinforcements would take at least a week to get there. The people wanted to evacuate as soon as possible. This argument could go on for hours. The dragon could attack the town. If the people did not evacuate, they would lose a whole lot more than just their businesses. Nobody wanted to see the other shops destroyed or the people destitute. Luke asked everybody to listen to him. He told them how he was an adventurer for 15 years. While he never raised his rank, he made many contacts in that time. For the sake of the town, he would try and get a hold of them. Dustin of the Two Spears, Roy of the Beast Prairies, Travis of Black Blade Ridge, and Theodore Beaufort, the Dragon Slayer. All of them were adventuring elite, rankers. In 15 years of adventuring, Luke had met a lot of people who looked down on him. But he also made a lot of friends. The first thing that they would do when they got here is hire novice adventurers to support them. This was a rare chance to get exposure to high-level adventures and watch them work, up close and personal stop. Nobody could let an opportunity like this get away from them. Luke turned to Merida and asked her to get some adventurers to keep watch on the 5th level of the dungeon until the reinforcements arrived. The guild manager had mentioned that. They also said they would introduce the high rankers to anyone who would specially be active about undertaking the job. Within seconds, the people of the town gathered up to sign up for the mission. Recognizing the chance to witness the elite in action, the townspeople eagerly signed up for the mission. With this issue sorted, Sylvia and Luke sat in a corner. Sylvia offered him some water. Luke was nervous and Sylvia noticed it. Luke did not want to call up his friends. It meant relying on old acquaintances who had gotten ahead in life. Since Luke was always a pathetic loser, they would see him as a headache they had to compensate for. Sylvia assured Luke that the people still needed him. Even though he felt as though his past didn't amount to much, it holds great value. He shouldn't think of himself as a pathetic loser. He should feel proud enough to boast to his friends. He had done a heck of a lot for that town, and he was loved. Luke felt like he was stuck. He went on a hiatus from adventuring and opened a weapons shop. It was like he couldn't fight on without shaking the shadows of his past. But he also couldn't say goodbye to adventuring entirely. He knew that he had to choose one or the other. Sylvia assured him that he did not have to decide between them right now. Green Hollow had always been a place where the weary folks burdened by worries gravitated. Things would not miraculously be fixed just by going there. Nobody could solve the problems or choose the path. But a lot of people came there and then went home with a little more spring in their step. It was not magic. It was because when a person can't move forward, it's important to stand still. It's good to see things from a different perspective. Maybe the answer has come to find Luke. Luke thanked Sylvia for her words. Her smile always made everything easier. The townsfolk approached Luke. They thanked him for helping them out back there. They were wondering about those rankers Luke was talking about. They were very eager to hear some stories about them. Sylvia teased Luke about being so popular. Luke knew he had to do his best right now for the people of Green Hollow. Next day, some chatter was heard. Sylvia wondered where Luke kept his spears. They had received an extraordinary from the Hunters Guild. The customer wanted one as tall as they were. Instead of hunting tools, they requested monster-slaying weapons. Even after what happened yesterday, they could not believe that the shop was so crowded. It was pretty rough even though Luke, Sylvia, and Sakura were working together. Garnet approached Luke and appreciated him doing pretty well for himself. Luke had no time to stand around and chat with her. Felix had told Garnet to take the day off, and she came by because she had a bone to pick with him. Luke handed her a big heavy box and asked her to put the contents out on the shelf nearby. Garnet was confused. She did not want to stop work, but Luke told her that they were running very ragged there. The sooner they served all the customers, the sooner he could talk. Luke had no time to talk. A long line of customers was waiting for him. Garnet finally agreed to help. Luke gave her some more boxes to carry. Sylvia was very happy that Garnet was there to help. She still had no idea that Garnet was a woman. She asked Luke to take a breather while she helped Sakura run the shop for a while. Luke and Garnet headed out back and she took off her helmet. Garnet started undressing. She wanted Luke to take a look at something between her breasts. Luke had done his job to repair Garnet perfectly, but he took away her mark. Before the dragon attacked Garnet, she had a scar on her chest. But the repair overrode it with a new skin stop and she wanted to replace the original scar. Luke needed a few more details. Theoretically, it was possible. Garnet was practically begging Luke to try and help her. It was like a mark of valor. Luke asked her to picture the moment she got the wound and hold it firmly in her mind. The skill constructed items using stored memories as a reference point. So if she could call up her memories of the wound, Luke could have a better chance for a repair. Garnet did her best to bring back her memory. She was running with her mother as a dark entity with the sword followed them. When they couldn't run anymore, her mother embraced her. The dark entity pushed his sword through her mother's back. The sword had penetrated so deep that even Garnet got stabbed when the sword came out from her mother's chest as they embraced. Luke had finally managed to restore the scar. Garnet was very happy as it was exactly the way before. The strange effects of analysis allowed Luke to read Garnet's memory. Before he could think more about it, Garnet presented him with a message from Felix. They had finally decided what to do with Luke. Felix said to come to the guild when his shop closed today. Garnet thanked Luke as she put back her helmet. Luke thought she was going to lecture him about keeping his nose out of her business. As long as she was happy, it was all good. The next day, Luke found himself face to face with Felix and another knight named Bradford. Garnet had given him a heads up about what was going on. In less than 3 days, the royal palace had made a decision, and Felix handed Luke an envelope stamped with the royal palace insignia. Inside was a letter, and Luke learned that the king himself would decide on a course of action a week from that day. The letter contained a summons, indicating that Luke needed the king's permission to harvest mithril or create armor and weapons from it. It was a big deal, and Luke hadn't expected to have a meeting with the king. However, there was more to the request. The king wanted Luke to craft a sword that couldn't be pulled from its pedestal. Luke, feeling a mix of surprise and amusement, thought it was a strange request but welcomed the distraction. Despite the unusual task, Luke took the commission seriously. He requested Garnet to keep an eye on his shop while he worked, emphasizing the importance of not letting it get destroyed. He acknowledged that guarding him might be a bit dull, so Garnet took the opportunity to assist Sylvia with her training. Luke understood that staying still for too long could make a person weak, so he appreciated Garnet's effort to stay active. In the week leading up to Luke's final audience with the king, members of the Order of Silver Wings dropped by to keep an eye on him. Garnet took a peek at the commission Luke was working on, curious about how he would create a sword that couldn't be removed from its pedestal. Having Garnet and Sylvia around didn't disrupt Luke's routine much. As Luke prepared to tackle the unique commission, Garnet's curiosity grew. She wondered aloud how Luke planned to make something like that. Luke, with a calm demeanor, explained his approach. If the sword had to stay on the pedestal, he figured he could fuse the pedestal and the blade together. The process began with meticulous planning. Luke sketched out the design, considering the balance between the pedestal and the blade. He wanted to create something visually appealing while ensuring its functionality. Garnet, observing the craftsmanship, couldn't help but be impressed by Luke's attention to detail. Luke decided to put his repair skills to the test. He chose an ordinary knife and arrow, decomposing them both with the intention of recomposing only the knife's blade. As he carefully went through the process, a unique idea struck him. What if he fused the recomposed blade with a rock? The result was a sword that seemed impossible to move. Excitement filled Luke as he presented the finished sword to Garnet and Sakura. Eager to test its immovability, Garnet and Sakura attempted to pull it from its pedestal, but their efforts were in vain. Luke had cleverly stopped the recomposition halfway, leaving the rock and the sword fused together. It was a creative solution, and the trio couldn't help but marvel at the ingenuity of the unconventional weapon. While most people might hesitate to take on such a peculiar job, especially before meeting the king, Luke found that the challenge helped ease his nervousness. The prospect of presenting this unique sword to the king added a touch of excitement to his otherwise apprehensive feelings. Amidst the preparations for the meeting with the king, Sakura couldn't help but express her curiosity about the monarch. Being from the east, she had little knowledge about King Alfred and the Kingdom of Westland. She learned that King Alfred had united most of the Westland over the last 20 years, and his influence continued to spread. People used to refer to the entire region as the Westlands, but now it was known as the Kingdom of Westland, marking the end of an era of warring chieftains. What intrigued Sakura even more was the king's humble origins as an adventurer. King Alfred's journey from a simple adventurer to a ruler had left a lasting impact on the Westland region. His story inspired many, showcasing that anyone, regardless of their background, could achieve greatness.